Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Nation Watch. It's Sunday, 2nd March 2025. I'm your host, Mervyn Williams. Today is Ghana Day, and we are coming to you live from the studio of the People's National Congress Reform here at Congress Place, Sophia. Outside, there are activities relating to Ghana Day celebrations, a tradition here at Congress Place on this date every year. And we wish the people of Ghana a very successful and enjoyable day, and to the Guyanese descendants of Africans from Ghana in particular, we wish you all happy Ghana Day. Today, we'll be discussing some recent developments in the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. And for those who did not benefit from our earlier sessions discussing this issue, here's a brief background. As you may very well be aware, there were disagreements between Great Britain and Venezuela, resulting in the 1897 Treaty of Washington, which led to the 1899 arbitral award, considered by all parties a full, perfect, and final settlement of the boundary between Guyana and Venezuela. The 1905 Boundary Commission did its work, settled that boundary issue, and that was accepted. Later on in 1962, Venezuela contended that the arbitral award was null and void for reasons that we've already discussed, but would not venture there in the interest of time today. Following on that, there was the Geneva Agreement of 1966, which provided opportunities for the discussion of Venezuela's objections, but recognizing still that the issue of the border had been settled and was in fact full, perfect, and finally settled. Full, perfectly, and finally settled. There was, of course, the UN Good Officer process. That process operated and sought a conclusion to the contention by Venezuela. I believe it was from 1990 to about 2017. And then there was the referral by after that process failed, there was a referral by the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2020, I believe it was, in the matter. That matter was then referred to the International Court of Justice, which ruled in 2020 that it had jurisdiction to hear and determine the matter. The matter is currently there. We moved to December 3rd, 2023, when Venezuela held a referendum and determined in that referendum that Essequibo was part of its territory. And obviously, we know it led to the 14th of December 2023, the Argyle engagement between Presidents Maduro of Venezuela and Ali of Guyana. And a lot happened since Argyle. We know that Venezuela decided that Essequibo would be a state of Venezuela. It added an additional star to its flag, symbolic of that inclusion. It decided through ratification of its parliament that there will be a budget to defend what they call La Guyana Essequiba. And that budget included, interestingly, provisions that would allow Venezuela to determine what happens in Guyana's territory of Essequibo, including investors, and Venezuela vowed to revoke what it termed illegal agreements for operations in that area. A governor was identified, a military general was identified as a governor, and we know that Venezuela has scheduled, I believe, April 17th of this year as election day for a governor of our Essequibo. Within recent times, there was some activity on the Venezuelan side of the border with Guyana, a buildup of troops, deployment of military assets. A bridge was constructed across the Cuyuni River, and the eastern half of Ancoco, which is Guyana's territory, which has been occupied by Venezuela military since 1966. Troops were deployed there, additional troops and military assets. The bridge was removed by the forces of nature, but nonetheless, there is and has been demonstration of military might by Venezuela on their side of the border with Guyana in that general area. There was the issue recently of the engagement of Guyana Defense Force personnel. The reports we have is that they were attacked by persons believed to be attached to a criminal gang called the Sindicatos from Venezuela. 6 of our troops were shot and injured, and reports suggest that 1 Venezuelan attacker may have died and a few others injured. Venezuela has decided that it was going to spin the issue and blame Guyana, saying that the Guyana Defense Force shot at civilians from their country. And more recently, the incursion by Venezuela into Guyana's waters with a military vessel, a maritime vessel that you see on screen. This vessel engaged international investors in Guyana's territorial waters, driving fear or seeking to drive fear in our investors, a blatant violation of everything that international law and international relations represent. To discuss these and related matters, I am joined today by Dr. Gary Best, retired Rear Admiral and former Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force, who is an authority not only on military issues, but issues of international relations. Welcome, Dr. Best.
Welcome, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Best, I hope that I got my dates right in the providing the background to our viewers. I would add to what I've said that this incursion took place yesterday morning. Mr. Irfan Ali, President of Guyana, contacted the leader of the opposition by telephone. There was a brief conversation followed by a formal briefing yesterday afternoon. And the opposition delegation was led by the leader of the opposition, Mr. Aubrey Compton Norton. He was accompanied by Shadow Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Amanza Walton Desir, MP, and former Ambassador Ronald Austin, while the government was represented by President Ali, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Todd, and the Attorney General, Mr. Anil Nandlal. We were, in fact, waiting for a release of a joint communique, Dr. Best, following the meeting. We have not seen any yet, so we continue to wait and hope that that document is soon released. Dr. Best, historically, diplomacy has been Guyana's first call in terms of its defense in this issue. Guyana, I believe, has foreign missions in about maybe 18 countries or so. I do not know what level of representation those missions are making on Guyana's behalf. I believe that Venezuela has representation in somewhere in the region of 78 capitals. And we know from our readings that Venezuela has been actively pursuing its agenda with respect to Essequibo through the work of those missions. In the meantime, Venezuela's military aggression is piling up. Is diplomacy enough for Guyana at this time? And if it's not, what other options avail themselves readily?
Well, thank you, Mervyn, for your question. It's a very interesting question, very deep one. There's several angles to this issue. But let me first commend the soldiers who responded when attacked by armed Venezuelans, I would not say sindicatos, armed Venezuelans in the Cuyuni River. So, I sympathize with their injuries and wish them a speedy recovery. But they were defending Guyana, notwithstanding the resources that they had available to them. It is important to set the context, as you mentioned, that Guyana has been occupied by Venezuela, part of Guyana, since 1966. Venezuela has continuously been in violation of international law, has continued violated Guyana's territorial integrity, attacked Guyana's sovereignty since 1966, the birthing of the nation state of Guyana. To your question, is diplomacy enough? It's a tricky issue at the moment, because if we're looking at what is happening geopolitically outside of the Guyana sphere, we recognize that diplomacy has taken on a different form and a different shape. And it has to be linked back to the person, not to the country that you're dealing with. For example, if you take the Ukrainian situation, that's Russia, United States, Europe, and Ukraine. That's a proxy war that's being fought between the Russians and the United States in Ukraine. If you look at apply the same calculus to Guyana, you see some similarities. Guyana, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and on the other side you have the Western powers. So the Guyana Defense Force, and within the construct of the defense of Guyana, the model has always been diplomacy force, but with an ability of the defense force to defend Guyana. And that defense of Guyana is limited to the resources it has available at the time. But even as I say that, defending Guyana is time-bound. And for how long will you be able to hold the enemy until international relations, international effort, international condemnation, and stretching it far, troops come in to assist you. And that is where we are at the moment. I believe it's important for us to recognize that it is incumbent that the defense force at this point in time is re-equipped and better equipped to hold Venezuela for a determined piece of time, maybe 72 hours, until international pressure comes in. So diplomacy, yes, will still be an active weapon by Guyana, but we cannot forget the importance of building up those resources of the Guyana Defense Force to defend Guyana. A second point is important also, is that Article 33 of the Guyana Constitution speaks to, it is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. It's not only the Guyana Defense Force. So we still need to ensure at the level of the nation state, led by the government, that every Guyanese recognize that he or she has a duty to defend the state. And it's a very important duty. It's a duty that falls upon you once you birthed in this country. I am not sure where the Guyanese are at the moment, but I tend to believe that they're thinking that there are allies or friendly nations that will come to Guyana's aid, and they will solve our problem. They will solve this Venezuela issue. I have my doubts with that, and I say why. The extent to which they will come. In international politics, there are no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests. The price of peace in Guyana is what I'm concerned about. What are we going to pay for this peace that we want? What's the price? We thought Argyle was the price, the declaration, which we'll come back to later. So which country will send troops to Guyana? For example, I'm answering the question of diplomacy. Which country will send troops to Guyana if Guyana is not committed and committing its own resources to this effort? So the price could be very high if it's another nation coming to assist Guyana, where Guyana is providing at least limited or not significant contribution to its own defense. And it's important. And the reason why I mention this because we go back to the 80s and the 90s, the late 70s, 80s, and the 90s, when we did spend a considerable amount of our budget on defense, but it kept Venezuela at bay. There was a lot of criticism with the budget expenditures to the defense force, but it kept Venezuela at bay. We have a large budget, much more resources, much more income, and we have less spending percentage-wise on the defense of Guyana. If we were to cut infrastructure budget by 60% or 40%, it would not affect the other sectors. You have more money available to put towards defense. Again, I'm still dealing with the question of diplomacy. Is diplomacy sufficient? I think diplomacy needs to be buttressed with a total national defense effort in Guyana, what we call defense in depth, linked to living frontiers, living borders, linked to ensuring that the persons who are in the Venezuelans in Guyana are not forward elements or forward agents of the Maduro regime. We have a country that is actively engaging to take 2/3 of Guyana. And for us to believe that the Venezuelans in Guyana are all refugees, I think that's foolhardy. No doubt, in my mind, they are forward elements of Venezuela in Guyana, actively working to destabilize the Guyanese economy, the Guyanese society for the benefit of President Maduro. The Venezuelans are wargaming also what is happening. You can see it is calculated. They tested us on land, now they're testing us at sea, and the next test will be by air. So I say the government has a duty and responsibility now to think this thing carefully, look at the political calculus, look at the military calculus. We have sufficient experts in Guyana from both sides of the divide, so to speak, that can sit with the government and come up with a comprehensive plan. We have to bring in both political experts, military experts to deal with this issue. So diplomacy may not be enough in this point in time, save and except it is buttressed by strong defense action, increased military capability, regional cooperation within the construct of what is happening right now by Venezuela.
Between 2000, I believe, 8 and 10, I don't know if I have the dates, the period correct, but there was some saber rattling from Venezuela. 2 pontoons were blown up by Venezuela in Guyana's territory. I believe you were active in the military at that time. There was only a diplomatic reach that was used at that stage. There was absolutely no military reaction as far as I am aware. And while diplomacy was being employed in that area, there were multiple flyovers with F-16 fighters, particularly in the northwestern region of Guyana. A show of military might. I believe it was at around the same time when Venezuela started to manufacture high-powered assault rifles on, I believe, on franchise from Russia. And at that time, they had recently received some F-16 fighter jets, also from the same source, I believe it was. So I believe there was already this test with the flyovers, which I suspect, like you pointed out, could re-emerge. Dr. Best, Guyana is region 1 specifically, from the information I've received, seemed to have been settled within recent times by a larger number of Venezuelan immigrants than Guyanese residents. This appeared to be in a build-up to what is calculated to be a quote-unquote election for a governor in Essequibo by Venezuela. Is this what is considered a soft invasion? And I ask that question against the background of the known fact that there's compulsory military service for particularly males in Venezuela, age 18 and above, save and except maybe you're the only child of the family and justifiably be exempted. So what it means is that a large percentage of the Venezuelans, maybe ruling out Waros, are either ex or current military service personnel, who are those in Guyana. What does this mean for us as a nation as we are confronted by Venezuela's aggression?
Well, we have argued before that we needed to separate who are bona fide refugees from the Venezuelans in Guyana. I don't think we've done that. I think we called for a bipartisan committee between the opposition and the government to determine exactly who are refugees and who are not refugees. We never got that cooperation from the government to embark on that. We also suggested, if you recall, that we have a limited amnesty within the Venezuelan community and therefore bring them under some regularization by the government so we know exactly who, again, discriminating positively, who really are refugees and who are not refugees. Because against the backdrop of Venezuela's continued aggression for over 3 decades, it is incumbent to understand and recognize that within the population from Venezuela, you must have elements who are not here really for the benefit of Guyana. And I think that is a big miss on the part of the government, in that we have not taken the opportunity to separate from the Venezuelan population here those who are bona fide refugees and those who are criminal elements and those who are from gangs and those who represent other parts of society that we don't really want in Guyana. So we've missed that opportunity. The opportunity can return, but we've missed that. The elections in Essequibo is a clear and present danger to Guyana's sovereignty. I believe the government needs to actively engage its intelligence resources within the region. The government ought to be saying clearly to the nation that any effort by any Guyanese or Venezuelan in Essequibo to conduct any elections is a clear and present threat to the laws of Guyana, and those persons will be prosecuted by law. We need to make very public statements when it comes to the issue of what is likely to happen in Essequibo, but not in Essequibo because it's being done in Venezuela, but it's linked to Essequibo. We have to ensure that the Venezuelans and Guyanese, perhaps, are not engaged in any act that is really a treason to the laws of Guyana. The other important thing to recognize is that the same elements that we use in foreign affairs, inviolability of borders, among other things, are set in the Guyana Constitution. So Venezuela, by its own actions, violate the articles and tenets of Guyana's Constitution by its own actions. And I said I will come back to the Argyle Declaration again. A declaration is much weaker than an agreement. The ability, this notion of comparing Argyle Declaration with the Geneva Agreement, right? It's a mismatch. We know that Venezuela always wanted a bilateral solution to the controversy that it created. Not a controversy that was created by Guyana. It always wanted a bilateral approach. It was denied that bilateral approach by Geneva Agreement. And that took us to the ICJ. And post-ICJ, the government found it necessary to create a bilateral relationship with Venezuela, which is the Argyle Agreement. So we moved from the ICJ back to the Argyle Agreement because Venezuela was arguing and still trying to argue that it's best for Guyana and Venezuela to solve the problem. But we are in the ICJ. We have provisional measures against Venezuela from the ICJ. We have condemnation, reversely speaking, from the ICJ in relation to Venezuela. We have the Argyle Declaration, which is a very weak document. And now Venezuela's recent action by invading Guyana's EEZ technically has kicked Argyle Declaration out of the equation. There's no Argyle Declaration any longer because Venezuela has violated.
As well. It's
right?
kicked Geneva.
Well, Geneva, I wouldn't say Geneva is kicked. Geneva evolved into the ICJ process. So the Geneva still, it's the bed upon which the ICJ now rests.
So we recognize
but
that.
I wouldn't say it is quick. But Argyle says out.
Because of the particular clause that the UN Secretary General acted upon. I said what I said in the context of Venezuela's position, that the only solution is bilateral.
Oh.
And they kicked that in the sense that they have violated their own position that bilaterals could solve this by resorting to military aggression.
Within the construct of the provisional orders of the ICJ. I see it's important for us now to look at the ICJ process and Venezuela's conduct. And I would say forget Argyle. I would say look at the ICJ provisional orders. Those are binding on the nation states. Argyle Declaration is not binding on Guyana. The president is not bound by Argyle Declaration. Neither is Venezuela. It's an expression of goodwill between two gentlemen. The provisional orders, those are the orders that are important to Guyana. That is what is in the international sphere. You're going to find that the United States and other countries who come as allies will refer to the provisional orders of the ICJ. I don't think they will be referring to the Argyle Declaration.
Venezuela has laid the grounds for rejecting the ICJ decision once it doesn't go in their favor. Now, here we are in a situation where Venezuela is saying, look, we are going to be aggressive. And here is Guyana sitting, anticipating an outcome from the International Court of Justice. Of course, Venezuela appears to be in contempt of the provisional orders that you alluded to. So, where do we go? Where do we go from here?
Well, I'll come back again to what I said earlier. It is the duty of every citizen to defend the state. It's not by accident that article is in our constitution. It has to combat it. We have to take care of our business, so to speak. We have to be resolute as a nation to recognize that we have to take care. If the entire state of Guyana goes into defense mode, it doesn't matter what military power Venezuela has. It cannot defeat a state. It can defeat a state entity, like the defense force if it's not well equipped. And even though we don't have enough time to equip it to match Venezuela, it can defeat an entity, but it cannot defeat the people. It cannot defeat the entire state. That's what we did in the 70s and 80s. All Guyanese felt that it was their duty to defend Guyana. So I'm saying let's go back there. The second thing I will say, and if you notice carefully, right, Venezuela did not sign on to Article 15 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Article 15 allows countries with adjacent coastlines to delimit their maritime borders. It did not sign on. It attempted to persuade Guyana to sign on to the Search and Rescue Convention. The Search and Rescue Convention, if Guyana had signed on to that, the area of responsibility for Venezuela would have been the entire Guyana coastal waters. Guyana did not sign on to that. What I'm saying is every step by Venezuela is designed to capture 2/3 of Guyana's territory. Therefore, every step by Guyana must be to defend 3/3 of Guyana's territory. Defend, and I use the word defend. So going back to your original question, is diplomacy enough? No, it's not enough. There must be a strong defending and defense element in the diplomacy that we're going to practice. And I mentioned earlier the whole notion of total national defense, defense in depth, living frontiers. Living frontiers. We have retired military that could occupy and go into frontier villages, work with the persons in the village. And let me just make this one point. This is the classic Israeli model. In Israel, every citizen is a soldier and every citizen defends the state. That article we have in the Constitution came from the Israeli model. And today we herald Israel as being formidable, along with its allies, to defend itself, along with its allies. But Israel is formidable. We have to ensure that we have a defense force that is formidable, along with allies. So no one is coming in to defend Guyana without no, want of a better term, blood being shed by Guyanese, effort, sweat being shed by us in this effort. So we have to come back to the whole notion of Guyana being able to defend itself.
I want to take us a step back and then come back to where we are. In the early days of this country's life as an independent nation, there was emphasis, governmental, statal emphasis on occupation, meaningful occupation of our frontiers. There was the birth of the Guyana National Service. There was the inclusion in our society of brothers and sisters from the smaller Caribbean islands, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, to a lesser extent, I believe, Jamaica, all of whom came here in search of a better life and who were later settled in hinterland communities like Matthews Ridge, Port Kaituma, Madia, and so on. So that our hinterland region, particularly the Essequibo frontiers, were populated, meaningfully populated. Land titles were given to indigenous peoples who continue to be private owners of those lands on the frontier. First point of contact, but I want to come to that first point of contact later on. Now I want to come to where we are. The Guyana National Service is no more. disbanded, all centers abandoned. The reserve of the Guyana Defense Force, the People's Militia, virtually scrapped, virtually scrapped. And I refer here to numbers depleting from thousands to maybe a couple of dozen. And our budget. 55% of our more than $1 trillion budget goes to public infrastructure. A very small percentage to national defense. Venezuela, on the other hand, went to their parliament with a petition for a budget for what they call the development of La Guyana Essequiba. A budget that allowed for military assets to be deployed on Guyana's side, in Guyana's territory, at Ankoko, to be deployed on the western side of the border in the vicinity of San Martin and adjoining areas. For the deployment of a naval vessel just yesterday in Guyana's waters. Guyana focuses more than half of its national budget, 2 years running, on public infrastructure. We clearly have our priorities mixed up here, Dr. Best. And I'm going to get political here, and you'll forgive me. But Guyana has focused, the People's Progressive Party government has focused on weaponizing the Guyana police force against citizens of this country that do not support the People's Progressive Party, and seem to have deliberately embarked on a venture to under-resource the Guyana Defense Force. How, therefore, in the face of the current evil that we confront, can we emerge from where we are?
Well, those are unfortunate realities that you mentioned, and as you said, you're very political. I mean, it's obvious to me, and this is a political construct we're in right now, it's obvious to me that we need a different government that is going to be better for the people. We need a government that is going to focus on defense. If you have to defend and secure what you have in a nation state, you cannot enjoy it if you can't defend it. And that's why I mentioned we'll come back to the syndicatos again. Earlier, I said that I'll come back to them. How is it possible for syndicatos to operate in the Cuyuni River where there's a substantive Venezuelan military presence? Why would a gang fire on a military force of another country? Those don't add up. In my view, those are forward elements of Venezuela. That was just testing the response of the Guyana Defense Force. How will we respond? How long it will take for us to respond? They're testing us. That's what they're doing. So, coming back to your question, politically speaking, the government needs to look at having a defense budget to develop and defend Essequibo. We're looking at having resources for Essequibo, both human resources and other types of resources in Essequibo for Essequibo to be safe. Guyana is not going to be safe if Essequibo is not safe. Essequibo has to be safe. And mind you, Ankoko Island is in the Cuyuni River, but it's part of the Essequibo. So Venezuela took its first stab at Essequibo since 1966. And we almost forget. And that's why in every conversation I have, I say, let's start with Venezuela occupying the half of Guyana's territory in Ankoko Island. We have to start there to remind people that Venezuela has been doing this since 1966. And under President Maduro, they've ramped up everything. We have the decrees claiming the EEZ, claiming territory. Now, what is happening now, and this is a breath of fresh air notwithstanding, the statements coming out of United States State Department and the Organization of American States condemnation, those are breath of fresh air indeed. I'm not going to discount that. Not at all. The president spoke to the nation, that was expected. Touched on some important areas, that was expected. But I would like to add that Guyana is a member of the United Nations Security Council. I thought in the public space, the government would have spoken about that. What action we will take within the Security Council. What allies have reformed alliances within the Security Council to bring this matter to the Security Council and get a condemnation by the UN Security Council of Venezuelan action. It's not going to be easy because you have the permanent five in the Security Council who have the vetoes. Russia, United States, France, etc., China included. But it is an action that Guyana can commence at the Security Council. I think the nation needs to hear that Guyana is going to use all efforts, all diplomatic efforts, including its current seat on the UN Security Council. So for me, that was I don't know if it's an omission, but I was expecting to hear that coming from the head of state. So coming back to your question again, Mervyn, where does it leave us? How do we respond? It comes back to Guyana again. It comes back to each and every Guyanese being committed that he or she has to defend this country, but he or she has to be equipped to defend this country. Not everyone will go into the defense force, but all the total national resources will have to be deployed to defend this country. It means all the trucks, all the buses, all the resources we have will have to come to this country. And Essequibo is a region under threat, and therefore Essequibo should be getting a larger part of our budget. And you would remember, you call Matakai Garrison.
Yeah.
Those are all set up previously.
Papaya Training Center.
All the National Service Centers you mentioned. Unfortunately, National Service was viewed politically as a negative to the government when they came in '92. Yeah. But it created a presence of young Guyanese presence in the interior. The reserve, as we knew it, it's a different formulation, but I would say that the model again that we had was you have a small compact defense force and a very large reserve.
Yep.
Every citizen or soldier came from Article 33, which is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. So you have the citizens as part of your reserve pool. So that provides a sense of security and confidence in the citizen that collectively we're able to defend this country. Collectively, we are prepared to shed our blood for this country. Collectively, we're prepared, and not with any ambivalence, but with certainty that we are prepared to defend the country. So it comes back to us at the end of the day and what we do.
I have two fundamental problems with the way things are being handled. To begin with, enough investment is not being made in Essequibo, in the county of Essequibo, by the government of Guyana. This 55% of our national budget is focused mostly in Berbice and parts of the Demerara coast and so on. But sufficient developmental interventions are not targeting the county of Essequibo, so that Essequibo, under the People's Progressive Party and successive governments, those communities have been treated as orphans. Mm-hmm. We know that between 2015 and 2020, there were changes. The town of Madia was developed. Bartico was declared a town. Development was taken there. Mabaroom was declared a municipality. The roads were developed. There was a focus. Same with Lethem, same with Matakai. There was a deliberate focus in infrastructure development in the Essequibo County, in the regions of the Essequibo County, to demonstrate not just occupation, but meaningful ownership and commitment to the people of the county of Essequibo. And I have that as a fundamental problem. And on the question of every Guyanese, in my day in school, the issue of the territorial controversy was a talking point on a daily basis. There was a deliberate process through which people were informed in schools, in field office and factories, as we say in the PNC. Mm-hmm. Information was disseminated. People were put on the alert. What is the People's Progressive Party doing now to sensitize the people of this country about the reality that confronts us as a nation state? To begin with, in the first interaction between president and leader of the opposition, it was Nation Watch that called for that, demanded it, this program. 2 days later, there was that interaction. Now, the incursion into Guyana's waters necessitated a a coordinated approach, and therefore the leader of the opposition was briefed by the president. In between those two briefing sessions, Dr. Best, there was no engagement. The Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Assembly of the Parliament has never been convened in that intervening period. The president of this republic has not engaged the citizens by way of report as to where we are as a nation state in this issue. The president of this republic has not, in the intervening time, engaged the leader of the opposition with a view to bringing him up to scratch on sensitive issues, perhaps not intended for public consumption at that time. We know that when Mr. Burnham and Mr. Hoyt were at the helm of this nation state, that Dr. Jagan, minority leader and then later on leader of the opposition, was at all times engaged. How, therefore, in these circumstances, can we realistically expect Guyanese to be engaged at the level that the Constitution requires us as citizens to be engaged? If you go there now and you ask the average taxi driver or minibus conductor, how do you feel about the territorial controversy between Guyana and Venezuela? They don't know anything. There's no information out there. It seems to me as though we have inflicted upon ourselves vulnerability that has trapped us and is doing us no good. How do we extricate ourselves from such situation?
Well, the role of the political party, our party itself, we have to now up our game and fill the void that created by bad government and bad governance. That's part of the role of the PNC. So we'll have to fill that gap. We'll have to go out and get the message to our people and other peoples in the communities where there's a gap by government. And I'm recognizing this gap in the government. As you mentioned, you have 55% or nearly 60% of the budget in infrastructure in a particular county. It means that you're deliberately leaving, because money is fungible. Budget is a forecast of spending. And the decisions we made to spend the money in a particular area, or we can spend the money in another area. So I think the People's National Congress, as a lead political party in this country, will have to up its game in its outreaches and its messaging to its larger communities to fill the gap that is left by government. And in many instances, the misinformation that also comes from government sources, the lack of interaction, the lack of information, news blackouts. We have these news blackouts that come when we have a major sensitive issue in the nation state. The party will have to take up that gap. This is one of the efforts of filling that gap, providing information to the people on Nation Watch. So we can't be, don't let's despair and lose hope, because as it appears to me, the dominoes seem to be falling, not against us, but with us, as we continue to engage the population, point out the inefficiencies of the government, which we are doing, and show the people of this country what an alternative government and governance system would look like. So we have to do two things at the same time: ensure that we're ready and poised to take government based on our policies, based on our directions, based on our own meetings and cogitations. I think we have a good team out there, and I think that's what we have to do. We have to engage, we have to promote, and we have to work to return to office and provide a better government and better governance to the people. And I keep using the term government and governance because the government does not recognize that the leader of the opposition is part of government and governance. They believe they have a constitutional duty to leave that person out, when that is incorrect. And that is not correct at all. The opposition is part of government and governance. Article 13 of the Constitution provides you and me, as citizens, with an opportunity and a right to be part of the decision-making of the country of Guyana. That Article 13 is what has given us the power. That's in our Constitution. So each of us has an opportunity and a right to go and to benefit and to participate in the decision-making of this country. That's the Constitution we have.
And to support those constitutional provisions, there must be the responsible actions of government to bring information to the citizenry that allows them to recognize A, what the circumstances are, and B, how they can become involved. And I believe those are missing links in this whole operation. And I just want to make this point. There are some detractors in the comment section, and I want to make this point very, very clear to them. We're not going to remove those comments, but know that the People's National Congress in government at all material times involved the opposition, particularly in matters relating to our territorial sovereignty, or territorial integrity and national sovereignty, and in opposition has always pledged and has fulfilled those pledges as we are fulfilling them today, of standing united with the government of Guyana on this issue. That's what the PNC is about when it comes to this particular issue. Dr. Best, there is the question of frontier. First line of contact, indigenous peoples. Barometer, a stone's throw from the border. Whitewater, Camwater, Yarakita, across a creek. Kaikan, across a river. Parima, close to the Tri-Junction. Charity, just across the Atlantic into the mouth of the Pomeroon River from Venezuela. These, well, of course, Itring and so on, we know very, very close to the border. A lot of indigenous peoples reside in villages on lands that they own. Historically, the indigenous population on the frontier were Guyana's eyes and ears. There were mechanisms put in place for the relay of information from the frontier to the center. And the Guyana Defense Force has always been on top of such communication over the years. It is apparent that if it exists still, it may have waned a bit, or significantly for that matter. But there's a bigger problem. You see, before the states were formed in South America, before state lines were drawn, there were indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples do not regard territorial borders the way others do, and will migrate across rivers and across lines at will. In fact, there are villages on the Guyana side whose elected leaders are closely related to the elected leaders of villages on the Venezuelan side. And so when it comes to potential armed conflict, when it comes to the exercise of aggression by our Western neighbors, it affects the indigenous peoples in a very significant way. It has a psychological impact on indigenous peoples, both sides of the border. Because if there's to be conflict, it'll be families against families. And if there are to be retreats for safety, for places of sanctuary, it could cause problems, because sanctuary for some on the western side of the border could be over this side. Mm-hmm. And there are potential difficult circumstances that can emerge. We are not hearing about interaction at the governmental level with our indigenous communities to bring some kind of comfort to them, to bring some kind of awareness to them about what's happening. I know that there have been times in the past when officers of the Guyana Defense Force will engage villages and bring them up to scratch with information. I myself, between 2015 and 2020, have been involved in arranging such discourses. Do you get a sense that there is a disregard for the indigenous frontier populations? And if you do, do you sense that there are some consequences that we may regret?
I believe that there's maybe a de-emphasis on the importance of the indigenous populations. When it comes to the Guyana Defense Force, I feel confident that the mechanism that was set up over the decades of information gathering and transmission, I think that continues with the GDF. I don't think they're short from that responsibility. But we're moving in a fast-paced world. We're going to in a world of AI now, artificial intelligence. So the point I'm making is that the resources have to be upgraded significantly to deal with the new information threat that is out there, the new type of warfare that will be waged, propaganda warfare, other types of warfare. So I think the information infrastructure is there. In relation to the government and its duty to the frontier populations, I think, yes, you have a point there, because you need to have government officials along with civil society going into these frontier areas and speak to them continuously on what is happening. To them, in my view, the frontier populations is not what diplomatic efforts the government is taking. To them is what efforts you're taking to make me feel more safe in my community. And that goes to the D in GDF, comes to defend and defense. That's important. And that's why I was emphasizing it, that we have to come back to defense, because we have to defend the nation. And by defending the nation, you have to defend the people. So in those communities, they must feel that there's some defense mechanism to which they can turn. And that is within their own villages, because years ago, they were all part of a notion of a reserve, that they reserve limited training, how they'll defend the communities. And then you have the defense force of itself. That way you have people much more experienced that will there to protect you. Those are the kind of defense we're talking about. Not only having contact with a Venezuelan enemy that comes over, but providing defense architecture and mechanisms to our villages and villagers, so they feel comfortable that if something should happen, then the defense force is there to assist them with that defense. That is all part of defense, and that is part of the total national defense that I spoke about, which involves all resources, all human and material resources within the nation state, within a community, a village, a region, and a country. And that is a concept that has been out there for decades, and the government can begin to operationalize that concept. And in doing that, we provide a better line of defense for frontier communities. And if our frontier communities are strong and we have good defense there, then the internal communities will be strong.
Back in time, 1969, when the communication devices were not available, the ones we have today, when the technology was way if you were to assess them now, you might say
archaic.
More than archaic, because those were the days of telegraphs and so on.
Yes.
Back then, the intelligence structure, when it comes to the frontiers and the relationship of the defense force with the frontier residents, effectively served to assist in a major way in playing down Venezuela's aggression in '69, when there was the Rupununi uprising, which was, I believe, motivated and funded and directed by the Venezuelan military. This is the information I've been picking up. I don't know. I've not done sufficient reading on it. Where the two families essentially in the Rupununi wanted to separate the part of the Essequibo from Guyana. And it seems to me, from the little reading that I've done, that it was Venezuelan inspired and it was part of their plan to seize some of our territory. Talk to us a little bit about that, if you will, please, Dr. Best. And in the context of what's happening now.
It is good that we're dealing with it contextually, because we had the Rupununi uprising, as you quite rightly mentioned, was about ceding part of Guyana territory to Venezuela, albeit inspired by Guyanese families with strong links to Venezuela. And that was happening during a period, the continuous period of Venezuela's claim to 2/3 of Guyana. I don't think why we should think differently now. Venezuela continues to make this claim against Guyana. And now Venezuela is still claiming Essequibo. And I go back to the point I make, that at the level of the security infrastructure in the state, we have to be interrogating every move by Venezuela, in Venezuela, and by extension, Venezuelan migrants or Venezuelan nationals in Guyana. We have to know whether or not they're communicating with Guyanese families. We have to know whether or not they're putting Guyanese families under pressure. We have to know whether or not we have another set of people who may want to declare parts of Essequibo to be part of Venezuela. This is a move that is being championed by the Venezuelan government. They're going to hold elections. We have to be prepared to act if a group of persons in Essequibo say, we recognize these elections. The government of Ghana has to be prepared immediately, as I said earlier, to have them arrested and prosecuted. And let me make this point. Ghana has always maintained the integrity of its borders, albeit in the 80s and 90s more intensely than now. We have evidence of the Coast Guard arresting Venezuelan vessels. I was the head of the Coast Guard at one time. I was a patrol commander of a vessel at one time. We did these patrols. We arrested Venezuelan vessels from illegally fishing in Guyana and prosecuted them in the courts of Guyana. That is on record. That is territorial integrity being maintained by the Defense Force and by the country. That information is at the ICJ, that we never abandoned the borders of this country. So the government has to view the Defense Force as a critical element in its policy for diplomacy. It has to see it in that light. Because in any nation state, because when we talk about allies coming to assist us, we're talking about the defense forces of allied nations coming to assist us, not the civilian population. So the Ghana Defense Force is a critical organ of government in this country. And it has to be given the resources required to ensure that it can provide the necessary services to every Guyanese. Because it's important, and that's why we cannot see the Defense Force just as, okay, Defense Force is a critical organization in this country. Very, very critical.
The UN conventions that treat with refugees prescribe certain things. We are in a very, very difficult position as a nation state. We are not in a position to easily determine who from Venezuela in this country, in Guyana, is a refugee and who is essentially first entry insurgents. What could be the consequences for the government of Guyana taking the decision to expel all Venezuelans from Guyana, all Venezuelans who are not of Guyanese parentage, that is to say? Given the current situation, I'm not saying this is what they should do. I'm asking whether, well, not whether, but what consequences could Guyana as a nation face if its government decides that there's a near and present threat presented to our country's territorial integrity by the presence of Venezuelans in Guyana, whose mission we do not clearly understand. They were to be arrested, rounded up, and deported back to Venezuela. What, if any, are the consequences under the UN conventions that treat with refugees? What consequences can they be for Guyana?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Mervyn. Let me say that I'm familiar vaguely with the convention. What I do know is under the convention, you can seek refugee status. They're usually going to be an office in the home country, like in Venezuela, where you can go to the country's embassy to begin the process to seek refugee status in that country. When you land illegally in a country, it's a different situation. And a lot of Venezuelans have landed illegally in Guyana. So there's no mechanism to determine if you sought refugee status. Because if you're seeking refugee status, you tend to go to the embassy within the country, seek the status, and then you can get to the country as a refugee. So if you have illegal Venezuelans coming into Guyana, I would say we cannot consider them refugees unless we establish them to be refugees. And that's why I had suggested in a piece before that we do an amnesty. I think Trinidad had done it. Do an amnesty, Venezuelans in country, and then determine based on evidence who are refugees and who are not refugees. But in that call, I had suggested that it be bipartisan. Both sides of the government, both the opposition and the government, should be involved in this determination of the refugee status to provide confidence that the outcome is accepted by all Guyanese. There are some consequences because people may believe and refer to Guyana as perhaps being inhuman to refugees. But again, I put refugees in uplifted commas because we have to determine first if they're refugees. And they're entitled to humane treatment if they are refugees. But we first have to know if they are refugees. And as you mentioned, Venezuelans of Guyanese parentage are not in contention because naturally they have a natural right to be here. Yeah. So yes, there are some, the consequences would be what, for example, if, a natural consequence of this is Guyana being labeled as having inhuman practice when it comes to these Venezuelans. But again, we don't know who are the refugees.
Even though the circumstances are what they are?
Well, the circumstances are exigent now because we have the United States deporting persons who they consider to be inimical to the interests of the nation state. Guyana has every right to protect its borders, every right to protect its people. And once we're there to protect the nation's interests, I think Guyana's action could be certified as positive. So we have to, given the circumstances, the current circumstances, where Venezuela is claiming 2/3 of Guyana, we have to be very, very careful about the Venezuelans who are in Guyana. We have a gentleman who's claiming 2/3 of Guyana. We have many Venezuelans in Guyana. We don't know their status. So naturally, we have to be careful and concerned about the Venezuelans. Naturally, you have to find out within that population. Government should be led to determine who refugees from who not refugees, who bona fide economic refugees. And that is something that we have not done as a nation.
But you have in Essequibo, particularly in the northwestern region, Venezuelans who tell you that this is their land. I mean, how do you treat in terms of national defense a situation where you have a hostile neighbor to the west? They're claiming your territory. They've declared it theirs. They plan to have an election for governor of your territory. Obviously, the election will be held among people from that country occupying your territory. And they're saying to you that we have a right here. This is ours. And then there is what I consider to be treasonous and seem not to be getting the attention of the authorities in Guyana. An established system operated by some Guyanese that transport Venezuelans to certain areas on the east bank of Essequibo, meet them there, transport them by land from there to a comfortable place where they can spend the night and perhaps a day, and then move them from there to farmlands, to places of employment, to backlands, to Parika, to Hubu, to and I hope they're listening, to Ruby back dam, to Good Hope back dam, to Hague back dam, to parts of Canals Polder, and to the Linden Sioux Dyke Highway. In the given circumstances, and knowing that there's mandatory subscription to the Venezuelan military system, Guyanese involved in bringing these people and putting them strategically in geographic spaces of this country. Isn't that, Dr. Bess, an act of treason?
It might be a stretch to say it's an act of treason. Because we don't want to use the word loosely, but certainly it's a level of insurgency in Guyana if you have people illegally transporting Venezuelans into this country and then redistributing them in villages or back of villages. That's an insurgent action. That is also illegal. It's human trafficking. These are all offenses. But I think the greater point, the underlying point, is it is happening under the watch of the government. It is happening under the watch of the government. It's an awareness as far as we are concerned that the government is aware. And the protagonists involved in this particular activity are known persons, are known agents. and some of them are connected to the government or suspected of being connected to the government. So herein lies the conundrum, where you have the suspicion that the government is involved for political purposes, turning a blind eye and looking and thinking only about another identification card and possibly another voter, and therefore we turn in a blind eye. So, but that requires political action. That is political action. We solve that with political action. And political action by the party is geared, its end result is geared at removing the current government and replacing it with a better government. So we have this sustained political action that is required. The fact that you mentioned all those places, that is information within our body politic of what is happening inside the country. So how we scrub the list, or how deep we scrub the list, also we're talking about the list here, becomes important because the list is infected. Perhaps you should scrub the entire list because it is infected.
Dr. Best, if you were asked to advise the government of Guyana, this is a national issue. This cannot be partisan. So if you were called upon to advise the government of Guyana, given the extant situation, on two measures that should be immediately embarked upon to help help Guyana's cause in the face of this kind of aggression from Venezuela, what two measures will you look at, and how would you advise the government?
Well, I think the issue is much broader than maybe just two measures.
It is. It certainly is.
That the government can take. But I think we have to go back on that construct between diplomacy and defense. And we had brought them together, we call defense diplomacy.
Right.
I think we have to come back there. I would say defense diplomacy must be the anchor upon which we will go. We have to twin defense and diplomacy. And I would say to the government, you need to have a strong defense diplomacy, forward-looking plan for the country. We improve our defense and we improve our diplomacy. They must be inextricably bound up. One goes with the other. And this will come back to the kind of resources that are allocated to these particular efforts. As we described earlier, we have most of the resources going to infrastructure. If you cut the infrastructure budget, it doesn't affect education, it doesn't affect health, it doesn't affect most of the other sectors, because this is a standalone infrastructure. It ostensibly will provide a better road, ostensibly so. But if we reduce the amount of roads we're going to build, we're not going to take away anything from education, anything from health. And those are resources available to go into defense. So as the budget is already constructed, you can see that there's sufficient resources within there to be redirected to defense efforts. And that can be easily achieved, even if the government makes it sound complicated. So I would say defense and diplomacy, those are the two areas I think we need to focus on. Defense and diplomacy, and defense is wide enough to include the hinterland, include the frontiers, include upgrading the equipment in the Guyana Defense Force. And diplomacy, when we come to diplomacy, we're talking about Guyana maximizing its presence at the UN Security Council. We're talking about the ambassadors becoming more present, more visible in the capitals. We're also talking about having permanent representation in the African Union, because you're talking about, I think, almost 53 states in that country. The African Union, that's a good place to be. You have good international cooperation among those countries. So we can expand our diplomatic reach beyond this current infrastructure to continents like Africa. We have relations with India, we have with China, but with the other Asian countries that had serious conflict in the country, like Vietnam and Thailand, and we can also learn from those countries, including other nation states. So I think we need to expand our diplomatic effort significantly and be in those capitals. Defense and diplomacy has a cost. They cost money. We've got better financial resources now. We need to put a fence around the yard we live in. We need to put a secure fence around the country we live in. No matter how we develop, if we don't put a fence, a secure fence to secure our nation state, we're going to have serious problems of breaching. So I go back to defense, diplomacy.
Defense and diplomacy, two pillars upon which Guyana can consolidate its efforts to secure its territorial integrity and its national sovereignty. Dr. Best, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me here on Nation Watch today and for bringing the kind of information that you have to the nation's attention. I trust that we are better informed, and I call upon the government of Guyana to, again, this is another call first made months and months ago to ensure that there's a national educational campaign to bring information to the people of this country regarding the Guyana Venezuela territorial controversy, where we are, what we can do as citizens to help Guyana's cause in this regard, to defend our territory, to secure our sovereignty. That's all the time we have today for Nation Watch. Thank you for joining us and staying with us the course of the program. Until we meet again next Sunday, God bless.